Okay, everybody. We are going to get started in about one more minute. I hope everybody's doing well today. We have been very busy on our side, as I'm sure many of you who participate in the ecosystem, either as assessors or as consultants, as RPs and RPOs, that you have been busy as well. Recently returned back from a trip to abroad from Europe and working with folks and teaching a CCP course in Europe, and they are under the gun as well. All right. Well, with that, let's get started. We appreciate your time and appreciate your attention. We recognize and appreciate also our sponsors relative to this CMC War Room. And we're going to talk about controlled environments at the very end, in addition to the CUI Marking Guide. All right. We're going to spend about an hour and a half together, and you are welcome, absolutely welcome, to be able to take screenshots of our slides and use them for your own personal use. All right. That is the limitation. Please be respectful. Literally, over the past 7 years, I guess. Yeah, since 2018. We have literally invested thousands and thousands of hours in understanding these requirements and the content, and some of that you're going to see because I want to show you that the message that DTC has presented has been very consistent for that last 7 years or 8 years, depending upon how you count that. So, a little bit about DTC Global, just so you know, this isn't a bait and switch, but we're going to tell you a little bit, which the caveats are important for your understanding of how we got to where we are and how we have done our due diligence in being a student of the requirements and being in the trenches with you, the defense industrial base, every single day. So I recognize the fact, and I am empathetic to the fact that the things I'm about to tell you, you may not like. I'm also empathetic about the fact that you're going to go through the 7 stages of grief. But I assure you that things that we tell you today will be accurate, 100% and consistent with the CUI Marking Guide and DoD policy. And we are going to explain why, so that you can either explain it to your organization, or if you have consulted or provided advice, that you can explain it to your clients. Most importantly, though, I've been very fortunate to be a part of this ecosystem since its founding, as serving on the Cyber AB's board of directors, and also certainly lots of fabulously talented people have been in with us since the very get-go in the CMC Industry Standards Council, which we developed and established after I left the Cyber AB board. And we are very fortunate enough to have some really amazing people. And the things that I'm going to tell you are not about impugning people about, whether they, didn't do their homework or that they didn't understand the standard well enough. This is a very, very complex set of requirements, and it's just not well understood. So we are going to walk through that, and we're going to show you how we navigate this. All right. So we do this for a living. This is not an academic exercise. We advise our clients exactly the way that we are explaining this to you. Okay. And have been doing so since 2018. So there's nothing new under the sun. And the things that I'm about to tell you have been consistent for that entire time since 2018, but again, not very well understood. All right. Now, there has been a migration of DoD policies during that time, and I'm going to show you that maturity and migration of the policies, but I'm also going to explain to you why they are all have been consistent. The interpretations of them throughout the ecosystem have not been consistent. That's the issue, okay? And the understanding from within DoD has not been consistent as well. But again, as a former DoD a senior civilian, I understand DoD policy. I spent lots of times developing policy. I spent lots of times doing analysis of that policy, and so hopefully we can leverage that insight and that understanding for you to understand it now. All right. So the first rule of CMMC is that no matter what I just said, you should not believe me. Okay. And you should not believe anyone who tells you anything that cannot show you. And just like many of our important bodies of work that influence our lives, a familiar, example of this may be, the Bible. You cannot take a sentence out of the good book and then take it out of context and then try to explain your position. That is not possible. You must explain what that good book says and what it means in the context of what's written. All right. So that includes DoD policy as well. And it is very complex in the context that it's written because the policies do not point to each other, but they do reinforce each other, although not with the precise clarity that really has Devin Casey and his team at the CMC program office have really done for us. And I'm very grateful to his efforts with that. I spent a lot of time with Devin in the first several years when he was with NARA. And that is also a principal reason why I was able to understand these requirements and be able to really articulate that in literally hundreds of briefs over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. I guess longer than that. Probably doing public briefs, probably maybe in 2020. Okay, so maybe yeah, maybe 5 years or so, maybe six. Maybe I did some in 2019. I can't remember. The point is that at the end of the day, though, you must not rely on whatever doodads I have behind my name, CCP, CCA, triple zero, double zero, triple 007 James Bond. None of that matters. What matters is that the things that I present to you have the appropriate references and citations. The things that people tell you have the appropriate references and citations. And one thing reinforces the other when it comes to DoD policy or some other aspect of these requirements. All right. So choose whom you listen to and whom you choose to verify their information and the sources of that information. Please very, very wisely. All right. So there are literally thousands of labor hours that you will invest in meeting these requirements if you already haven't done that, and not all of that effort will pay off. Okay. All right. So with that, I'm going to talk about the fact that very talented people, very talented people in the ecosystem have gotten this wrong. Okay. And I really generally don't like to talk about right and wrong because it makes it I don't know, it makes it ego based. What I like to really point to is that the things that have not been stated, or the things that have been stated, have not been consistent with the standard, okay, or the standards, or the DoD policy, or the 32 CFR Part 2002, or narrow guidance. Okay. And it is very complex. And here's the reason why for that. It's not that they're lazy or they lacked the effort. The reality, though, is that the challenges that we faced in here is the complexity of the amount of information that we have to consume and reconcile. Over from 2024 to 2025, we have received over 800 plus pages of guidance and information about the CMC rule. The CMC rule is the most complex regulatory rule ever written. Okay. Started out with 257 pages, if I remember correctly, and then literally doubled in size when it went from the draft to the final rule when you incorporate the responsible public comments within the preamble. All right. If you don't understand that the preamble is authoritative guidance, I asked that directly to the DoD, and the DoD replied that yes, of course it is authoritative guidance with how the DoD sees the need for you in order to meet their requirements and their expectations, and providing you the guidance to meet those expectations in reference to being successful in certification. So if you ignored the response to public comments and ignored the preamble to the rule, I urge you to go back and read that line for line. because that's exactly what I did. Okay, because it will be very insightful to and amplify everything that I've will tell you today and many of the things that I've stated in the past. Also, I want to just point out that the new DoD CUI Marking Training Aid was released in December of 2024. That is a second rewrite to the original document. And many of these documents have been written, two times, four times, and so on and so forth. So remember that that many people did not know that the CUI training aid was released, including myself, and I tend to stay on top of this probably and maybe as good as or better than most human beings on the planet. So the reality is that the information when it's released there's no public spectacle to it. So you have to pay attention to detail, and you have to stay on top of things and check and recheck the dodcui.mil website routinely for those updates. Okay. So, a great explanation of why many were not consistent and accurate with the requirements is sort of this depiction, what I call the spaghetti meatballs diagram. Okay. It is a complex environment, folks, and this is just a snapshot representation of those interdependencies that was done I think Tom did this in 2020 or 2021. Okay. And this is even outdated. This is but it's a visual representation that I like to use for you to understand that there are interdependencies here that go way beyond the CMC assessment guide. They go way beyond the NIST 800-171. The NIST 800-171, as you will find out, and I will show you just shortly, does not incorporate the DoD policies that apply underneath the DFAR 7012. Okay, and we're going to walk through that process in so that you do understand that. What the dirty little secret in this entire episode is the fact that if you look at the totality, the failure rate or the failure to proceed to certification or to JSVA or for C3POs to receive their certification is at least 90%, probably greater than that. They're probably on the means of 600 or 700 organizations that have tried to go through the process and that have been screened out or that have not been successful in that process in order to meet these requirements. And underneath the various instances, underneath GSVA, underneath the C3PAO program for certified, the attempt to become a certified organization, or the other organizations relative to the CMC certification process right now. So the reality is that there is a tsunami of failure, okay, which is hidden and based on what the DoD typifies as the failure to understand requirements and the failure to have the appropriate, adequate, and sufficient evidence. So that should represent to you that this is very complex. And if your consultant or your RP or your RPO got this, was told you, gave you guidance that wasn't consistent with the DoD requirements, please, we need to offer some grace here. I realize that everyone is heavily invested in what they think, and that would include myself, right? But we must reconcile that with what is written, and in doing so, be very meticulous and very detailed about what the requirements say, and then go back through, take the time, and get it right. All right. Remember that the ecosystem is built on, I teach this in my CMC professional course and my CCA course that I teach as well, that the ecosystem is based on four fundamental dynamics. You have to understand the certification and the model, okay, and how the ecosystem functions and who does what, and that's explained pretty well actually in the CMC program final rule. Okay, there are additional resources that you can look at. You can look at the supplemental materials to include the brand new V2.13 CMC model, okay, document. That is a good document for you to understand what you may not have understood back in the day, back in CMC 1.0, back in CMC 1.4, okay, and all the previous iterations, CMC 2 V V2.10, Okay. Now, just prior to the final rule, the most recent supplemental documents, you cannot rely on what you knew. You cannot rely on what you knew, folks. All right. And just knowing that, wow, the CMC models has gone down from 5 levels to 3 is not enough, folks. You have to do your homework. You're investing thousands of hours into getting this right. Okay. That includes understanding the CUI requirements themselves, because the CUI requirements are the cornerstone for getting scoping right. Okay, not the CMC scoping guide. The CMC scoping guide is an excellent tool for which I've been previously very negative. But the V2.13, not any other version, is correct, finally, thank goodness, is very well written and aligned with the CMC, the final program rule, and does a great job in providing you the guidance. But it is not the only thing that's necessary for you to understand. You must understand the CUI categories and the requirements that are associated with each of those categories, and we're going to touch on that as we progress. You must understand the requirements and the controls themselves. Okay, that's in the NIST standard 171 that are articulated, of course, in the CMC supplemental materials as well. Okay, you must understand the resources that the 32 CFR Part 170 cites within the Part 170.4 section. Okay, when it has its definitions and it has its references by citation. Okay, incorporated by citation. That means, just like it says in the rule, that when they incorporate a reference in the CMC final program rule, 32 CFR Part 170, that it's as if it's incorporated into the rule word for word itself. Okay, so if you were to walk through and look at the references and look at the citations, well over 1,000 pages of cumulative information, not the rule itself, but just the references that are incorporated. Now, does all of that information apply? Of course it doesn't. The point though is that is what the NIST 800-171 is based on. And so we take those references, and then the NIST tailored those references into the document we call NIST 800 Special Publication 171 and in the Rev 2, and then to be able to provide the fundamental requirements for protecting CUI at the moderate level. All right. The assessment process and the assessment evidence are also critical. You must understand what adequate and sufficient evidence means. You must understand the latest version of the CAP. Okay. And a new version will come out here shortly, I believe. And you must be able to navigate the assessment process and provide adequate and sufficient evidence in order to certify. Okay. So these are the 4 pillars, if you will, in my opinion, of really being successful at this. All right. This doesn't mean it's easy. Doesn't mean it's easy. It just means those are the critical points of navigation that when we start climbing the mountain together, that's what we have to do. So the use of the content is for your individual use only, and it is strictly limited. Okay. All right. So let's talk about at the beginning. Let's talk about the DoD CUI, and let's talk about qualifying information, and let's talk about how the D4 7012. Okay, and you're going to understand why I'm telling you this just here shortly. All right, and that if you're new to the environment, if you're just dusting things off, we have got very advanced people inside of this webinar, and we've got moderately experienced people inside this webinar, and we have brand new folks that are waking up to the oh my God moment when they realize that they have to meet these requirements. So in order to baseline what we're going to get into within the CUI marking guide, you must understand how that the cumulative information, one thing builds upon another. And when we get to the CUI marking guide, that document is the very top pinnacle document of the mountain, because that is the document that marking guidance has been the least understood of every single thing that I've ever taught in the last 7 years. I literally have probably a couple hundred different briefs explaining CUI marking and identification and what is CUI in a number of in a couple hundred different ways. I've tried to explain that story, all right, over the past 7 years. So let's understand one thing is that the CUI is received and shared and created in performance of a contract. It comes, some documents, some documents come from the DoD to the prime contractor. But the prime contractor is principally responsible for creating most of the documents that qualify as CUI, not the DoD. Okay. That has been a major source of confusion that somehow the DoD ferry sprinkles its DoD documents throughout the supply chain in order for people to understand what these requirements are. And nothing could be further from the truth. The DoD has very limited documents, and one of the principal documents is the award of the contract underneath the D4 7012 contract with the statement of work that goes from the DoD to the prime contractor. Okay, that's where it really begins. Okay, the DoD did not create all of the line drawings for the F-35. That did not help it. That did not help it. They awarded the contract to Lockheed Martin to create the line drawings for the F-35. Okay. So that is a principal cornerstone of misunderstanding that somehow the accumulation of documents just flutters in from the DoD and they're supposed to be marked and they're not marked. No, that's not what happens at all. So the DoD and the D4 7012 contract clause says that you are going to the DoD CUI is by definition of covered defense information, CUI that's marked or otherwise identified, provided to the non-DoD entity, that would be you, by or on behalf of the DoD in support of the performance of the contract underneath a legal agreement or a contract clause. Or, and that's not an and, or the actual contractor creates or develops or receives or transmits that information and they use and store that information on behalf of the DoD, okay, in support of the performance of the contract. Okay. So it's an or. It is either received or marked or otherwise identified, or it's collected, developed, and received. So that states that some CUI should and will be marked. So the other half of that CUI, it may be unmarked or maybe developed in performance of that work. So what we have to do is we have to identify the information as the 32 CFR Part 202 tells us to treat information that qualifies as CUI as described in the 32 CFR Part 202 and the CUI registry. We have to treat it as it is CUI. That is the cornerstone guidance for which the new CUI marking guide is built. Why? Because the DoD must follow that guidance. But there's additional things into that. We know from the 32 CFR that the lack of CUI marking on information does not exempt the authorized holder, that's you, and we're going to explain that in greater detail, from meeting the requirements and the responsibilities relative to the CUI. Okay? That is a challenge. There's no doubt about that. But the reality about that is that is the standard. Those four things serve as the cornerstone standard for the new DoD CUI marking guide and all the other policies that have been written that support that the new DoD CUI marking guide. So when we look at that, Jack reached out to me. I can't remember Jack's last name on LinkedIn, or maybe he wrote a comment. I can't remember, that said, "Hey Regan, listen, well we're supposed to follow the NARA CUI marking guide that's produced from them, not the DoD CUI marking guide. Or what happens if you have CUI that's marked with the NARA markings, but it's not marked as CUI? Does that mean that we don't have to protect it?" And the answer is, of course not. The reality is that the new CUI marking guide or CUI marking aid, right, which is on the left, must be followed according to DoD policy. It must be, and that means we don't use the old one. Okay, so the September 3, 2020 CUI marking handbook is obsolete. It has been replaced by the document on the left-hand side that was released in December 2024. What that means is that we do not use, underneath the D4 7012 contract clause, we do not use the NARA CUI marking handbook to provide our guidance, and there are specific caveats from that, and I'll touch on them in just a second. Okay, why is it that we don't use the NARA CUI marking guide? Well, or the CUI Marking Handbook, rather. And the answer is because the 32 CFR Part 200.214 safeguarding A4 says that authorized holders, that's you, must comply with the policy in this order. That's the 32 CFR, this part, okay, and the CUI registry, and review any applicable agency CUI policies for additional instructions. So when the DoD provides you additional instructions underneath the DFARS 252 204 712 contract clause, that means you must follow those additional instructions. Okay. It goes on to say, for information designated as CUI specified, authorized holders must follow the procedures in the underlying laws and regulations, and government policies. Okay, that's very important for you to know that, and it's a very important for you to understand that, because we're going to build upon that and your responsibilities relative to the new CUI Marking Training Aid. All right. So, what does that mean? That means that you do not follow the old DoD CUI Marking Training Handbook, and you do not follow the NARA CUI Marking Handbook, their CUI Marking Handbook, NARA's, which is on the right, unless unless the DoD does not provide you specific guidance about something that's covered in that handbook. Okay, so if the DoD, and I'm going to give you an example of this, for the SF 901, the CUI cover sheet. Okay, the CUI cover sheet is covered in the DoD and the NARA CUI Marking Training Aid. It is not covered in the DoD CUI Marking Training Aid, the new one, which is in the center. So if the marking guidance is provided underneath by the NARA and additional guidance is not provided by the DoD CUI, then you follow the NARA original NARA guidance. Okay, so you can use certainly the SF 901. You would follow and follow the guidance associated with using that the CUI cover sheet, how to mark the CUI cover sheet, exactly as it described by NARA. Why? Because there's no additional guidance provided by the DoD in the new training aid. Now, there's another point of confusion about this, is that, well, wait, it said for specified specified CUI. Well, what does that mean? That means that when I'm underneath the 32 CFR Part 2002 and I look in the CUI registry and I'm under a DFARS contract clause, which means I'm performing work for the DoD, then that means I'm going to follow the DoD's rules and the DoD's requirements. If I were doing something in addition for NASA, I would follow and apply those requirements specifically to by NASA policy. And if NASA policy doesn't direct me on something in particular, then I certainly would follow the NARA guidance. Okay. Now, if I have controlled technical information underneath the DFAR 7012 contract clause, or I've had export controlled information, or HIPAA data, or privacy information, anything that falls within the CUI registry relative to the performance of the contract that I'm doing for the DoD, that is specified because the DFAR 7012 contract clause specifically states within the definition of covered defense information that CTI and any other category of CUI that's developed or received in performance of the contract is CUI and must be treated as such, okay, underneath the DFAR 7012 requirements. So when I look up in a very simple thing, the new DoD CUI marking guide says that I should, do I know it's CUI? And we're going to cover this in just a second. Then I'm going to look in the CUI registry. Well, when I look in the CUI registry, it's a DFAR 7012. That means that everything that I do underneath the DFAR 7012 is going to be specified CUI. All of it, every single piece. Although some of the categories of CUI that I may produce in performance of the contract or receive in performance of the contract may only have basic safeguarding requirements underneath the authority in the CUI registry, I'm always going to apply DoD policy and DoD requirements to that. I have to do both. I have to follow what the CUI laws, regulations, and government policies tell me to do according to the CUI category. And when I'm performing on a DoD contract, I must apply DoD policy as well. All right. Now, if you have any questions, we're going to spend 30 minutes in questions at the end. Okay. Now, let's talk about the fact that because that's true, I'm only going to use the CUI Marking Training Aid that was recently released for the in December 2024, I'm only going to use that guide unless the specific guidance isn't provided for in there, right? Alternate marking methods is provided underneath the specific CUI notice, and I'll show you that in just a second. That specific CUI notice I'm going to follow because the new CUI Marking Training Aid does not discuss about alternate marking methods. So I can use an SF 901, or I can use a conspicuously marking guidance that's provided by NARA. Why? Again, because there's no contradicting or no, not contradicting, there's no additional guidance that provided by the DoD underneath those particular issues. So people asked years ago, well, listen, Reagan, I don't even have to follow DoD policy. It doesn't say that in the NIST 800-171. Of course it does, but people just don't realize that. Okay, and underneath section 1.1. But the reality, though, is you do. And I'm going to show you why that's true on the D-Force 7012 contract clause, why you must apply DoD policy in addition to the evidence that I've already provided you underneath the 32 CFR Part 170. I'm sorry, underneath the 32 CFR 200214 A4 guidance. Okay, I'm going to show you in addition to where DoD specifically says if you're doing it underneath the D-Force 7012 contract clause, then you need to apply this DoD policy. Now, the Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency had a CUI FAQ, and underneath that FAQ, they described the fact that there are four main policies that govern CUI. Of course, the Executive Order 13556, the 32 CFR Part 202, and the DoD Instruction 5248, which is the cornerstone policy for CUI and in performance of a D-Force 7012 contract clause. All right. Also, the NIST 800-171 is also required, and that's specified in the contract clause. And it's also required in the 32 CFR Part 2002, and it's also required by DoD policy in 8582.01. So all of those things are true. Now, the DCSA FAQ gave two insightful pieces of information that I've been telling people about for years, which is, in some cases, the DoD Instruction 5248 includes more stringent requirements than other policies. And guess what? When those policies, when the instruction or any other DoD requires you to do something in additional to, you must follow the more stringent guidance, given the example underneath that the DCSA has here. All right. So if DoD policy says that you have to do something else, then that something else, my friend, it must be followed according to DoD policy and according to the contract clause, DFARS 252, 204, 7012. All right. Now, there was previous policy before the DoD Instruction 5248 came out in March 6th of 2020. All right. There was a DoD manual that was DoD Manual 5200.01, Volume 4. When the DoD Instruction 5248 came out, it superseded specific guidance provided within that manual. All right. But I'm going to show you in contrast how they say the same things. It's just that the DoD Instruction 5248 provides lots of additional guidance that we're going to cover very carefully so that we understand what our responsibilities are relative to what the CUI Marking Training Aid specifies. All right. So people say, well, we don't even have to follow the 5248. And of course, I showed you what the DCSA FAQ says. But in addition to that, though, the policy itself calls out the fact that if you're doing this, this establishes policy and assigns responsibilities and prescribes procedures for CUI throughout the DoD. That includes you, by the way, in accordance with the executive order, in accordance with the 32 CFR 2002, which establishes the CUI program, and in accordance with what? The DFARS 252, 204, 7012 contract clause. So everything in this policy of the DoD instruction applies to the 7012. And the Chapter 5 in the back calls out specific highlights that apply to the 7012. So not just the Chapter 5 applies to the 7012, but everything applies to the 7012. But the Chapter 5 calls out the highlights, and I'm going to show you where that's true. All right. So underneath this policy, it specifically said it is the policy of the DoD, okay, as a part of the phased-in program of the DoD CUI program, okay, and the ISU oversight. So they're not doing it in contradiction with the ISU, but in coordination with and by permission, by the way, of the ISU. And it's gonna tell you, this policy is gonna tell you about the designation, the handling, decontrolling of CUI, including CUI identification, sharing, marking, safeguarding, storage, dissemination, destruction, and records management, and how this will be handled in accordance with what? The DFARS 7008 and the 7012, which we all know and love. Okay? When applied by contract to non-DoD systems. That's to you. All right? So there is no difference and there's no daylight between what is required of you and what is stated in this policy. All right? It further states that it is DoD policy and that terms and specific marking requirements will be promulgated by the USD INS in future guidance. Guess who wrote the new CUI Training Marking Aid? One guess. Yes, it was the USD INS. Okay, and we have their future guidance was issued later, in the original DOPSR CUI Marking Handbook, and has been refreshed and thank goodness, and clarified, thank goodness, within its newest iteration in December. So this establishes the protocol. There's no other one. Okay, and for this issuance and between DoD components. So that's it. This resolves disputes and for implementing and interpreting what is required of you amongst all DoD components, period, and of story. Okay. Now, the DoD states within section 5.1 that there is a shared responsibility between DoD and industry when established by contract. That's the D4 7012 and legal agreements and arrangements in the identification, creation, sharing, marking, safeguarding, storage, dissemination, control, disposition, destruction, and records management of CUI documents and material. Shared responsibility. A shared responsibility means that as the new CUI Training Marking Aid tells you, you do have the responsibility and authority to mark CUI. Most definitely, 100% end of story. And I will show you and continue to show you why that's true. Said it's essential to identify and apply the general dissemination principles and guidance as described in the CUI, that's executive agent, in accordance with the 32 CFR Part 2002. Contracts containing CUI shared from DoD or generated, managed, and transmitted by the contractor via their information systems will be in accordance with this issuance when incorporated into each DoD contract. So that, again, there is no daylight between DoD policy and the requirements which you must meet. So when non-DoD information systems, that's you, okay, underneath the D4 7012, must meet requirements, you got to do it in accordance with the contractual requirements identified for the particular CUI in the contract that's relative to the performance of your contract, as required in DoD Instruction 8582.01 and the DFARS 252.204.7012 contract clause. All right. And when it is established by contract, contractors and subcontractors and consultants must comply with the safeguard requirements identified in the contract for all types of CUI. So it does not matter if it's privacy data. It doesn't matter if it's non-nuclear proliferation data. It doesn't matter if it's export control data. It doesn't matter if it's control technical information. That all of the requirements apply to the types of CUI that you receive or you develop in performance of the contract and everyone associated with the performance of the contract for which you are responsible for as a contractor, as a prime, as a higher tier subcontractor, or as a subcontractor. Okay. So with that, let's continue through because why am I nailing this? Because I never, ever, ever, hopefully, want to have to explain this in public again. I want this to be the definitive moment that everyone realizes that there's nowhere to run. We have to do this, folks. Okay. So let's walk through. And also, by the way, I want to arm and equip you when you have to explain this, and you should. Okay. If you got it wrong, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. You got it wrong, man. This is really complex. really complex. And you got to give yourself some grace. And if your consultant got it wrong, or whoever you paid to help you got it wrong, you got to give them some grace because this is complex, but no more. We have to do this and we have to do it now. So the program office and requiring activity must identify, and you're going to ask me, well, Reagan, that's our out. Must identify DOCUI at the time of the contract award, and if necessary, provide guidance or information on the aggregation and compilation. Now, if I just cherry pick this single little sentence here, they didn't identify it. Woohoo! We don't have any CUI. Well, guess what, my friends? You don't understand how it is that they identify the DoD CUI at the time of the contract award, but I will explain you how that's stated within the DoD policy itself. Okay. All right. The program office or requiring activity must review recurring and renewed contracts for CUI to comply with this issuance. All right. So that's what that says. Now I'm going to explain to you what that means in that top bullet in just here in a second. So this paragraph highlights requirements for DoD contractors. Whenever DoD provides information to contractors, that means the DoD provides you a document, right? Provides you a document that says this document is CUI. It must identify whether the information is CUI. But that 95% of the time, my friends, the DoD does not provide you information in a document that says this is CUI. You create that CUI according to the contract and the statement of work. And I will show you where it specifically calls this out. And this is what led to the general misunderstanding and the propagation about the fact that, oh, well, they didn't tell me it was CUI, so it's not CUI. Well, if you cherry pick this out, then that would be great. Now we've got two sentences to support why we've been doing it wrong for the past 7 years. But my friends, that is not DoD policy. All right, so stick with me. Whenever the DoD provides CUI, meaning it provides it to you, it hands you a document and says, hey, this document is CUI, then it must be marked. Okay. Or the CUI is generated by non-DoD entities. Protective measures and dissemination controls, including those directed by the relevant law, regulation, and government policy, will be articulated in the contract or other legal agreement. So, my friends, when you generate CUI, and the vast majority, I'm speaking to the defense industrial base here, the vast majority of companies generate 99% of the CUI that they have. And I'll show you why. So, when we walk through this progress, I don't have time to cover it because we're covering a lot of information here. But if you don't know that the DoD Procurement Toolbox Cybersecurity FAQ exists, you need to know that that exists. And you need to understand it. And you need to download it. You need to read it. You need to highlight it. Now, listen, it's important that you know that that there are dated passages in there because this is cumulative. So in the older black text, it's sometimes either elaborated and sometimes superseded by the blue text in this document. And this new document, I apologize, I didn't download the latest version of this just here recently, but it does not mention, I'm pretty sure it does not mention the brand new CUI Marking Training Aid or its or the guidance it provides within this DoD procurement toolbox. However, though, there is a section that if we rip that apart piece by piece, I could show you word for word how it exactly aligns with the stated guidance within the brand new document. But for the purposes of time and the fact that I've done that about 100 times before this, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this now. And this is probably my only time when I'm going to say, trust me, that this document aligns with exactly what the new CUI marking training aid tells you to do. Okay. But for time, I just don't have time to go through it because there are about 8 questions there and you have to rip them apart piece by piece. What's more important is that I'm rooting this into the evidence to show you if you've got to show someone else, or as you go through the 7 stages of grief, you yourself will be convinced not by what Reagan has said, not by all the doodads and all the accolades, but by what is written. Okay. Now, let's keep going though. At the end of the day, when we start accumulating this information, one of the key components to what the DoD Instruction 5248 is telling you, and is backed up over and over and over again in DoD policy, is that the authorized holder of the document or the material is responsible for determining at the time of creation whether the information in a document or material falls into a CUI category. If so, the authorized holder, that's you, and I'm going to explain that why if you didn't realize that, the authorized holder is responsible for applying CUI markings and dissemination instructions accordingly. This is a requirement. It is your responsibility, and you must do this according to DoD policy. You must do this in order to meet the NIST Standard 171 requirements, and you must do this in order to protect CUI, which is the paramount of all of the reason that we're doing this. We are not, folks, we are not doing this for compliance sake. We are not dodging the mattress police to hide the fact that we've cut off the tags on the mattresses. Okay. We are protecting this information because there's the future of our country is at stake in protecting this information. It is the most dire and most critical aspect of the national security interest, probably in the history of the Department of Defense, because we are bleeding. Not the estimate is $900 billion in technical information every year. That's the entire defense budget lost every year to our enemies that are seeking to destroy us. So, well, let's get over that, and now we put that behind us a little bit. We're going to touch on that a little bit more, but hang with me. The DCSA FAQ makes it very clear that anyone can create CUI. So this has nothing to do with the fact that you're a prime contractor, or you're a tier 1, or you're a tier 2, or you're a tier 3, or tier 4, or tier 5, or tier 6, or tier 7, or tier 8, or tier 9. None of that matters. What matters is that if you're performing, and we're going to talk about what type of information is qualifying information, just so to be clear, what type of information is qualifying information. Anyone who is receiving or developing CUI, which is qualifying information underneath DoD policy and underneath the 32 CFR Part 202 that qualifies as CUI, is CUI and must be safeguarded and handled as such. Now, the thing that the DCSA FAQ fails to recognize, and this is the cornerstone of our problem and this cornerstone of our challenge that we all have, is that it said 3 years ago, however, in most situations, industry will be guided by its customer on what CUI is and isn't. And the reality that you and I both know is that that is not happening and hasn't happened since the very beginning. And I am privy to cases where the prime contractor or a higher tier subcontractor said, we don't want you to market a CUI because if you don't market a CUI, it's not CUI. Okay. That is absolutely not true. That is a dereliction of duty, in my humble opinion. And that you should be tarred and feathered in the public square by giving people guidance like that. Okay. Because that undermines our national security. It undermines the safety of our warfighters. It undermines the safety of the technical advantage that we have to win wars. And that is unacceptable because for the inconvenience of cashing the check to perform defense contracts, but not be willing to do the hard stuff that's subsequent with protecting the data. So let's get back to what is covered defense information. Okay. This is a 2023. Okay. And by this time, I've done probably 200 or 300 briefs on identifying and marking CUI. Okay. So in the contractual term, covered defense information is a contractual term. There's nothing called CDI that doesn't exist. Okay. Covered defense information is a term used by the acquisition section of the DoD. Okay. That has a definition, and the definition includes control technical information or any other category of information that is marked or otherwise identified in the contract task order or delivery order that is provided to a contractor or on behalf of the DoD in support of the performance of the contract. Or, okay, not and, or collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, and stored on behalf of the DoD. All right? So these two things are two different things. Yes, CUI can be marked or otherwise identified, and it also can be not marked or otherwise identified and developed in performance of the contract. But how is it that I even know that I have CUI? You have CUI because you are developing developing technical information for the performance of a contract. We're talking about specifically CTI, and performance of the contract, or the information that you receive or develop is meets a CUI category in the performance of your contract. That's how you do it, and that's exactly what the CUI Marking Training Aid tells you to do. Okay, so it's vital and important that any information provided by or developed for the DoD, when it meets a definition in the CUI registry, is qualifying information and is CUI. Okay, now many of you may be like, have a chill going down your spine right now, but that is DoD policy, folks. And I'm going to show you in several different iterations why that's true and what type of information that incurs. So let's get to that. So I'm an authorized holder because I have the responsibility to create or mark CUI in performance of my contract. I have the authority and the responsibility to do that underneath the 32 CFR. I have the responsibility to do that underneath CUI laws, regulations, and government-wide policies and DoD policy because I am incorporated in these requirements according to the DFARS contract clause that I'm performing by. Okay. Now, in the older version of the policy, in the DoD and DoD manual, uh, um, uh, 5200 5200.01 volume 4, which is on the right hand side. Okay, this is before the DoD instruction 5248. That the manual gave very specific advice, which gave me the insight to be able to tell people about this years and years ago. And it says, when CUI is to be provided by or generated by DoD contractors, the controls and protective measures to be applied shall be described in the pertinent contract. How were they described in the contract documents? By contract clause and statement of work, or a DD Form 254 or Defense Contract Security Classification Guide. Again, people totally misconstrued and they thought that was an and that's not an because you won't ever receive a DoD instruction, a DoD Form 254 or a Defense Security Classification Guide unless you do classified work too. So if you do classified work and unclassified work and have CUI, then you have the benefit of the DD 254 and you have the benefit of the DoD's SCG, the Security Classification Guide. But if you don't do classified work, you will never see those two documents. You will only have what's before the or, the contract clause and the statement of work. So when the statement of work tells you to do something and it tells you to create or design and we'll get into the specifics of that statement of work. Guess what, my friends? That is the only notification that the DoD is required to do in order for you to have to meet these requirements. That's it. There's no DoD ferry that's going to fly from the Pentagon and fly all the way down to the 17th tier inside of the DoD supply chain to explain to a CNC shop in Fort Worth, Texas, within the F-35 program, and then stamp their documents for them. That is never going to happen. Okay? So this relationship is critical because there is only two things that are prerequisites for them to require you to meet these requirements: a contract clause and a statement of work that the information qualifies as CUI, and that's it. So let's get to what that would be. Okay. So if you're in the defense industrial base and you make something, right, or you design something relative to the performance of a manufacturing task, you have inputs, and those inputs include what are the requirements for what are we doing here, right? What are we going to design? What are we going to engineer? How are we going to machine that? What's the tooling that we need? Does it exist? Do we have to design it? Do we have to create it? What are the materials that we're going to use? Can we buy them off the shelf? Are they specific materials with specific specifications that are unique to the performance of the contract? All of those specifications are in your statement of work, and you realize that, right? Or it tells you we want you to build the thing that you participated in the RFP or the RFQ in. Okay. Now that we've got the award. So when that RFP or the RFQ says, we won, we want you to build or do what you said you would do in relationship to the performance of the contract, according to the DoD specification, my friend, those outputs are qualifying technical information according to DoD policy. Okay. So when you engineer to order, design to print, build to spec, processing to spec, maintenance, repair, and overhaul, assembly to order, all those things and all the information, I guarantee you 99.9% of that information relative to the DoD specification as described in DoD policy is 100% CUI. All right. So we're going to get into that, exactly what the DoD policy describes in that, because that's going to be your cornerstone for the marking, applying the marking guidance underneath the December 24th DoD CUI Marking Training Aid. Okay. I'm sorry. I said December 24th, December 2024. All right. So if I have requirements and technical specifications, if I have design, unique materials, supply chain materials and components that I got to have built, designed, manufacturing processes, outside processes, assembly, finishing, quality, and fulfillment, guess what, my friends? That is going to involve technical information that you're very likely to develop in the performance of the work. So this is the example of something that I actually did prior to. We put the copyright on it in 2023, but maybe 2021. It could be as early as 2022. But this exact same slide is from those briefs so long ago. Okay, this is not new information. What's new information, though, folks, is the fact that people have been in denial, been in hope, and hope is not a method. Okay. So now we are in under the hardcore reality that everything that it really says in DoD policy and in the 32 CFR and in CUI laws and regulations must be applied in order to meet requirements, in order to meet the D47012, and in order to certify. All right. So when they're critical components here and ideas that I need you to connect. Unmarked CUI must be treated when the information qualifies as CUI. Authorized holders who in good faith believe that the designation of the CUI is improper or incorrect, or who believe they have received unmarked CUI, should notify the dissemination agency of that belief. That's a should. That's not a must. Okay? What you're telling me, Reagan, is if I'm in a CNC shop and that's in tier 17 within the F-35 ecosystem, I should notify the dissemination agency. Yes, you should. Are you really going to do that? No, you're not going to do that, because that's not how business works. But you should do that, okay? But that's not a must, all right? That's not a prerequisite. Also, when we look at the definition of CUI, designating CUI, it says that it occurs when an authorized holder, that's you, consistent with the part, with this part, that's the 32 CFR, and the CUI registry, determines that a specific information item falls into a CUI category and subcategory. Guess what, my friends? That's what you're doing. And you are designating CUI because you are authorized to designate CUI according to the 32 CFR 2002, and you are also authorized to designate CUI according to the DoD policy. You have to look at the process of designation in order to understand how that can be true. So the authorized holder who designates the CUI must make the recipients aware of the information status. How do you do that? You do that by marking it, by labeling it. Okay. Reagan developed CUI in the performance of a contract, and that in that design that I developed, I have to determine, is this design CUI? Well, it's according to the DoD contract, D47012. It's according to the DoD specification. Okay. It's in performance of the DoD contract. I developed it in performance of the DoD contract. It's not marked. And guess what? I am responsible for marking it according to my responsibilities as an authorized holder and underneath DoD policy. And guess what? I had to say, well, guess what? I'm going to go to the CR registry. Guess what? It follows underneath the controlled technical information, and it also falls underneath the export controlled information. And I am responsible for marking it to ensure that any recipients of the information are aware that it is both CTI and it is export controlled. Okay. Now, people have said well, Reagan, you can't mark, this is years past. You can't mark CUI. You don't have the responsibility. You don't have the authority to do that. Well, guess what, friends? That's simply not true. And how do we know that that's not true? Well, we knew that that's not true then because the DoD policies themselves said that's true, not true. Because the originator of the document, that the originator of the document didn't say the originator of the document that is the DoD employee, the DoD agency. No, it said that the originator of the document is responsible for determining at the time of origination, determining at origination whether the information may qualify as a CUI. Now, notice that and that are identical. And what it tells us now underneath the DoD instruction that superseded this document. Okay. Now, people said, well, wait, you're going to overmark. You could get it wrong. Well, that's true. But if you undermark CUI, you place our country at risk and you undermine the entire purpose of doing all of this work. Okay. So if you get it wrong, the DoD instruction the DoD manual provides us insight that the DoD does not care. They can fix it and make the correction. And of course, underneath DoD requirements, they should notify you. It says shall, not should, of the changes. And maybe that happens and maybe it doesn't. That's not the point. The point is that the DoD expects you as the originator to mark the document, and it provides that guidance as of December 2024, very simply and very directly. All right. Now, if we also look to the FAR CUI rule, the FAR CUI rule has written directly into the FAR Part 12, not the Part 7, but into the FAR Part 12 to simply and expressly state that contractors have the responsibility to mark CUI. Okay, it says that. So go read the FAR CUI rule, and it clarifies this. It's not a brand new thing. It clarifies what our responsibilities are so that there's no legal argument, there's no legal confusion that good people, well-intended, have gotten wrong for many years now, including those that have written books about the issue. All right. So I also want to point out that this is a 2019 slide, and this 2019 slide that I wrote says exactly what you're required to do today. Okay, exactly what you're required to do today. So I guess me mentioning that, yeah. Anyway, the point though is that underneath the 32 CFR, underneath the DFR 7012, underneath the export control requirements, you must mark the CUI. Okay, you must mark it in export control requirements. You must mark it according to the CTI requirements as well, or any other category that's appropriate. All right. You have responsibilities as authorized holders, and you and your company must meet the requirements for handling CUI, period. Okay. And if it's not properly marked, you must mark it and you must treat it as CUI if it qualifies. Okay. Now, the 32 CFR Part 202, I'm sorry, the 32 CFR, I'm sorry, the DoD instruction 5248 was issued in 2020. Okay. And later in March of 2020. And I thought that it was going to end up being, the DOTA 5200.01 Volume 5. That's absolutely not correct. It would end up being the DoD Instruction 5248. The point, though, is this. It's been a really long time I've been trying to explain this to folks, and I'm glad you're here now. So when we talk about marking CUI, the new DoD instruction is referring to all of the primary references which provided the guidance which it articulates to you. Okay? That and guidance for if you want to talk about alternate marking methods is the CUI Notice 2020-1. Why would that guidance still apply? Because the new DoD CUI Training Aid does not include any alternate marking guidance or the SF901 or some other things. All right? It's only principally talking about digital documents. And that's another point that I probably should have clarified. Does this mean only documents? Well, the CUI Marking Training Aid specifically addresses documents and digital documents and real documents. But if we look at the CUI FAR rule, the CUI FAR rule makes it very clear underneath the definition of information that any representation of CUI in any form, tangible and intangible, is CUI and must be safeguarded and must be properly marked or identified. Okay, so I'm going to touch on that a bit in another couple slides. So let's get down to the CUI marking training aid specifically. Okay, so let's talk about that. So if we determine step one, we determine it says it's I'm blowing up the font. Determine if unclassified information is in your document is CUI. That presumes that you have a D4 7012 contract clause. That presumes that the information is in performance of a contract. That presumes that information is received or developed in performance of that DoD contract. The reason why it's telling you to do that is because you have the responsibilities of an authorized holder, because you are an authorized holder underneath the DFARS 252 204 7012 contract clause. And per this definition on your left-hand side, you are permitted to designate and handle CUI in accordance with the 32 CFR Part 2002. And so the second one says, we'll compare the information, step two, compare the information with the information in the DoD CUI registry. Okay. So I've got a D4 7012 contract clause. It's covered defense information because it's part of the definition of covered defense information. And it's previously unmarked or newly identified qualifying information. Okay. And guess what? Now I go to the DoD CUI registry or the NARA CUI registry, either one. And now I look and I'm a defense manufacturer out there. And guess what? That information is technical information according to the definition within controlled technical information. And because of that, now I'm directed, according to the DoD policy, to conduct a careful analysis using DoD instruction 5230.24. And now, guess what? I decide I got to mark it because it's CTI or export controlled. How do I know that, Regan? How do I know that you're not making that up? Well, if you look underneath the DoD instruction 5230.24, okay, and you look underneath section 3.4, okay, it says these 4 key bullet points. All unclassified CTI must be marked as CUI in accordance with the DoD instruction 5248. DoD legacy material, including CTI, will not be marked, will be required to be remarked or redacted while it remains underneath the control of DoD or it's accessed online or downloaded for use within the DoD. Okay. It also says, however, any such information or new derivative information must be marked as CUI if a careful analysis determines that it qualifies as CUI. And so that's what the new CUI marking training aid is referring to when it says, look at the CUI registry. If the information meets the definition of CUI registry as a category CUI, then mark it. Step 3. Okay. I want to point out, though, the 3 remaining bullet points. Unclassified CTI originated by underneath the control of the DoD will be marked with a DoD distribution statement. So you must mark the any technical information, not with an LDC, okay, but with a distribution statement, okay. You must mark that. And how do you know that? Well, we're going to get into that just here shortly. So the CUI that is not technical information, as defined in the CUI glossary. I'm sorry, that's incorrect. Let me hit bullet point C. CUI that is not technical information, as defined in the glossary of the DoD instruction 5230.24. That's where this comes from. Shall be marked in accordance with the DoD instruction 5248. So that means that that instruction that gives us guidance on controlled technical information is telling you that the definitions in the glossary are really important. And so we're going to take a close look at them. Procedures for marking DoD unclassified CTI will align with the requirements in DoD instruction 5248 and the CUI marking training aid does. Now, this paragraph D is also misconstrued because it's only in the initial implementation phase that you follow this guidance. Remember that it said new guidance will come and it'll be developed by INS, and lo and behold, we have new guidance. So we don't use the phase 1 implementation guidance that's described in the 5248 specifically. We use the CUI marking training aid. So It says, without a doubt, in the CUI Marking Training Aid that contractors are authorized to create and mark CUI documents and can be listed as the POC in the CUI designated indicator block. Period. There's no ands, there's no ifs or buts about that fact. So where are we? Okay, where are we? We're an authorized holder. We are designating CUI because designating CUI means that we're going to identify information that qualifies as CUI and determine the specific category that the CUI falls into. That's exactly word for word, almost word for word, of what the instruction itself tells us to do. So we are designating CUI. Why? Because we're allowed to, according to the definition of authorized holder per the 32 CFR 2002, and of course per DoD policy. Because why are we doing that? Because prior to disseminating CUI, we must label the information as CUI according to the marking guidance. Now, this says issued by the CUI EA, the executive agent, and this is where people, good, well-intentioned people have gotten it not quite right. That's it. You would use this if there were no other additional CUI marking guidance provided by the DoD or any federal agency. Then you would use the marking guidance provided by the CUI EA. That's the CUI marking handbook that I talked about previously at the beginning. All right. So when we are given additional guidance, then we follow that guidance per the 32 CFR 20214 A4. All right. And then, of course, it says that we must comply with the CUI policy, and it gives us that. Why do we do that? Because we have to apply the applicable CUI policies provided by the agency for additional instructions. And of course, the authorized holder who designates the CUI, and that's what we're doing here, must make the recipients aware of the information status in accordance with this part. How do we do that? When we designate CUI, we just don't say, hey, this is CUI, this is CTI, and this is export controlled. We have to label it and mark it. That's how we make recipients aware of the requirements. Okay. Now, this section within the CUI Marking Training Aid is intended to without doubt, to avoid any confusion created by the previous marking guidance, which it wasn't very clear, folks. So don't follow the CUI marking guide provided by NARA unless you're performing non-DoD contracts and it tells you to use the CUI marking guide. Then use it. Don't use the old one, the 2021. Use only what's provided for within the CUI Marking Training Aid, and don't use the Phase 1 implementation guidance as it's described within the DoD Instruction 5248 because it has been superseded by the guidance provided by INS as of December 24th, 2024, or December 2024. Okay, what about LDCs? So let's talk about the nuts and bolts of marking the document. Okay, now I could provide the example straight from the CUI Marking Training Aid, but I'm going to use one that's probably more relevant to folks out, within the audience. All right. So you've seen a line drawing all day long, thousands of them. They all look the same. Okay, pretty much, except they don't have the proper markings, which is the problem, right? So if we have a line drawing, it should have a CUI banner marking and a CUI footer marking. CUI at the top and CUI at the bottom. If it's export controlled information, it would have the mandatory DoD control export control warning statement. It must have that. Now, if you're more advanced out there that understand the ITAR and EAR requirements underneath export control reform, and the additional marking is applicable and necessary, then you would add the additional export control warning because it doesn't quite say the same thing as the mandatory DoD marking. Why? Because the ITAR and the AAR underneath export control reform require the top marking. On the bottom marking, the DoD requires that. And the DoD says that you must do that. So we remember underneath the 7012, we must follow both the DoD policy and any other CUI laws, regulations, and government-wide policies. And if this were an export control document, then and it were appropriate to add the top marking according to the ITAR or EAR, then we would add the top marking underneath the export controlled reform guidance. All right. Also, there's the CUI designated indicator, which is required underneath DoD policy, and the distribution statement, which is unique to technical documents. That's required underneath DoD Instruction 5200 30.24. Now, Would we use LDCs on a technical document? No, you would not use LDCs underneath the technical document. Why would you not use LDCs underneath the technical document? Because the DoD instruction 5248 says that you don't use LDCs underneath the technical document. So you should not see a technical document with FedCon on it. If you see that, you may, it's not the correct marking. It should have only distribution statements on that document. Why? Because the DoD instruction 5248 says that's true, and because the DoD instruction 5230.24, which is identified in the CUI registry, which is identified in the DoD policy, says that you'll follow that guidance when marking technical information, and it says only use distribution statements. All right. So I'm not going to cover that. Now I am going to cover, though, CUI access. It says access should be encouraged and permitted to the extent that it abides by the laws, regulations, and government-wide policies that establish the information as CUI. It furthers the lawful government purpose and is not restricted by some LDC or some other restricted requirement, or is not otherwise prohibited by law. All those things are true. All those things make the person whom would receive the CUI authorized, but it does not make them eligible or qualified. There are additional requirements by the DoD that make them eligible and qualified. They must be screened, and they must be the DoD. They must do the mandatory DoD CUI, the CUI training. Okay, and that's required on an annual basis. When we talk about access, we must talk about access in the context of the DoD instruction 5248. It defines access very specifically, that the access is the ability or opportunity to acquire or examine or retrieve CUI. So we cannot provide access to anyone who does not meet the requirements that are provided for here and the additional requirements underneath DoD policy. So if we do provide access and it is prohibited or it is restricted or the person is not eligible or qualified or authorized, then we have violated DoD policy, and that's an unauthorized disclosure. Okay, and that must be reported. So the Rel 2 markings are complex, and I'm not going to talk about them here because mostly they don't apply to you, because this is fortunately they could have tailored this document a little bit better for most for those in industry. Nevertheless, in some in industry this does apply to you, but it's the vast minority and not the majority. But the distribution statements do apply to you, and we're going to cover that in specific detail. And I know I'm going over. I'm over in the Q&A section, but this is really important for us to cover, and I'm happy to stay on as long as it takes to answer your questions. So don't worry about that piece. All right. So in accordance with the 5230.24 distribution statements on technical information, distribution statements can be applied to newly created, revised, or previously unmarked, classified, and unclassified technical information. This is directly from that top paragraph, okay? It's just blown up so you can read it. Technical information is defined as technical data or computer software that can be used or adapted for use in design, production, manufacture, assembly, repair, overhaul, processing, engineering, development, operation, maintenance, adapting, testing, reconstruction of goods and materials of any technology that advances state of the art or in the area of significant military applicability in the United States. Okay, examples are blueprints, engineering, drawings, specifications, computer software. See DoD instruction 5230.24. Now, it's not for a judgment call that this CUI Marking Training Aid is not intended for you to make a judgment call on, wow, this really doesn't advance the state of the art or anything else. That is totally irrelevant to you. What is relevant to you is that it meets the definition. If it meets the definition of technical information and it's a DFARS 7012 contract clause, that's what matters to you. Okay, it's not intending to make another value judgment for you to try to escape and evade national security. If you are executing underneath the DFARS 7012 contract clause and it's unique to the performance of a DoD contract, guess what? It is and qualifies as technical information. And I will show you where that's true, by the way. So when we look up the DoD instruction 5230.24, it is purposely intended and written, okay? Not the old version, the new version, January 10th of 2023, to establish a framework and markings for managing, sharing, and distributing technical information in accordance with this instruction. It aligns marking procedures with the DoD instruction 5248 and the Part 2002 32 CFR U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. Why? because it helps originators. That's you. That's the DoD. That's anyone in performance of a DFR 7012 contract clause to determine what extent it must be controlled in accordance with DoD Instruction 5230.24 when it's not publicly available information. All right, that and it also may be export controlled. So when we apply this DoD Instruction 5230.24, it is for newly created, exactly the same words that the CUI Marking Training Aid used. For revised, just exactly as the CUI Marking Training Aid said. Previously unmarked, exactly as the CUI Marking Training Aid did. For classified, which is beyond the scope of this discussion, or unclassified technical information that's originated from all DoD-funded RDT&E programs. That's research, development, test, and evaluation, which I used to do for a living, by the way, for the DoD, managed by defense acquisition and sustainment activities. That's the contracting people, okay? And that includes the system design, development, production, procurement, sustainment, including logistics, maintenance, material readiness, and collaboration activities. So that's pretty much everything that you could possibly think of in the performance of a D4 7012 contract clause, folks. Okay? So what do we have? We have the D4 7012 contract clause. We have covered defense information. We have controlled technical information or any other category of CUI. And when it is CTI, we technical information, we use the DoD Instruction 5230.24 to determine that it is controlled technical information because it has a military and space application, because it is similar to and similar to the examples provided in the DoD instruction, and it could be in any form, tangible and intangible. That's where the CUI, the FAR CUI rule gets its clarified definition of information. So it provides you in the instruction in 1.1. I'm not going to go through this all because I want to save some time here for questions. But it provides every single example that you could probably ever think of, including part numbers, including bills of material, okay, with configuration management documentation, engineering data, and engineering information. And I'm going to show you how it does that. And catalog item identifications. That's part numbers, folks. That's a fancy term for part numbers, okay? Blueprints, instructions, and so on and so forth. Standard specifications. So if it's a standard or specification relative to the performance of your contract with a 7012 in your statement of work that's unique to the DoD military and space application, guess what? It qualifies as CUI and controlled technical information, and it may qualify as export controlled information as well. So let's just walk through that very briefly, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. And if we have questions that touch on this, we can. Controlled technical information has a definition, but it's an inclusive definition. It's an inclusive definition that directly refers to what? To the DFARS 252-204-7012 I'm sorry, to the DoD instruction 5230.24 in the CR registry. You can go look that up. And that sub definition to that, for which the CUI Marking Training Aid and DoD policy specifically refer to, is the definition of technical information, which is in the glossary of the 5230.24. And in that glossary, that's a inclusive definition to the definition for configuration management information, which is in the glossary of that document. It's also inclusive to the definition of engineering data, which is in the glossary of that DoD instruction 5230.24. And when it refers to DoD instruction 5230, DoD directive 5230.25, it's referring to military and space application, which is defined in that document. Okay. If all of those things apply, you better believe it, CTI. And also, it could certainly be export controlled information, because it would fall underneath the definition of export controlled technical information, which is in the glossary of 5230.24. Okay. So let's summarize here, because we've learned a lot. What is CUI? Well, CUI is what's in the CUI registry or in the DoD CUI registry. And the CUI Marking Training Aid makes it clear about that. Well, we got to mark it because DoD policy says it. And because it specifically says that this policy applies to the D4 7012 contract clause. And then according to DoD policy, how are we going to mark it? Well, we look at the DoD instruction 5230.24, and that's exactly what the CUI Marking Training Aid requires us to do. During the performance of the contract, relative to the performance of the contract or the subcontracts and because the subcontractors and suppliers that we need to meet the requirements are our responsibility. And the prime contractor is responsible for its entire supply chain, but you, my friends, are responsible for your subcontractors and yours that you provide this information to in order to perform the contract. So we got the standard way that we mark the CUI on the left-hand side as an example that relative to you. And then the CUI Marking Training Aid exemplifies and highlights the fact that there are two predominant types of technical information: export controlled information and controlled technical information, both of which require a distribution statement. Now, just because you see in distribution statement, the guide says, well, it doesn't automatically require qualify as CTI, and that's true. And why is that true? That's true. Sorry, because the distribution A says it's approved for public release. And so if it were a distribution statement that said distribution A, it's approved for public release, and it cannot be CUI because the definition specifically exempts lawfully publicly released information. So if it falls underneath distribution A and someone tells you it's CUI, it is absolutely not CUI if that distribution A is accurate. And they may have gotten it wrong. Okay. All right. So how do we know? We know this because that's exactly what section 3.4 underneath the 5230.24 tells us, my friends. That's exactly what they tell us. Okay. So that distribution statement A says, oh, it's approved for public release. Well, then it can't be CUI because CUI is not lawfully publicly available. So if that's accurate, it's not CUI. Okay. However, distribution statement B is authorized only to the U.S. government. So it's never going to be distribution statement B because you shouldn't receive that. You're just a defense industrial based company, and you're somewhere in the supply chain, and you're not the U.S. government. So you shouldn't receive something that says distribution statement B. And distribution statement E and F are very unlikely that you will receive that. Now, there are some very sophisticated prime contractors out there and that may receive that information, or sophisticated programs. But however, the vast majority of organizations will never receive B or shouldn't receive B, and never will see distribution statement E or F. What does that leave us with, folks? That leaves us with C and D. So C means that it's going to the U.S. government agencies and their contractors. Okay, so that means that if you don't want it released to those agencies and those contractors, then it would be distribution statement D, which is by far the most common, hands down, across all of the defense industrial base. All right. So those two you can always look out for. If a distribution statement is properly marked, it's likely to be C or D. Okay. It's likely to be D. And if it doesn't have a distribution statement, then we can follow the guidance within the DoD CUI Marking Training Aid, and that says that it's of course not available for public release, and it has to be protected. Well, how should it be protected? Well, then that means it would be protected very likely by C or D. How do we know that? Well, we could look at any of the previous documents that we may have received in performance of the contract. They could be marked as well. But in the absence of that, we have to mark it per DoD policy with the distribution statement, and the distribution statement D will never steer you wrong. If someone has to change that, there's no penalty box, folks. They're glad that you protected the information. And anyone who tells you different is not consistent with DoD policy. So, step one, determine the information is classified, and lack of CUI marking does not exempt you from doing that. That's exactly what the new DoD CUI Marking Aid exemplifies. Step two, compare the information with the DoD CUI registry. Bingo. Step three, you mark it. It's just that simple, folks. There's no rocket science here. Okay. Now, the DoD instruction requires you to do a careful analysis, and you should be careful. And you should use, if you have any questions about this, use the DoD instruction 5230.24 as a guideline. Okay. Why is this important? It's important to you because there are no POAM items that are allowed on these specific things in order for you to be able to affirm and certify. That means that managing the physical access to CUI, which includes marking, by the way, and marking documents, falls underneath 3.10.5. And there are other marking requirements, which I'll go over just here briefly. The point, though, is if you have not marked CUI, then you are not managing the physical access to CUI because your authorized holders do not know what is CUI and what's not, and you haven't informed them of the requirements, which is DoD policy and required underneath the 32 CFR Part 202. Okay. Now, also, according to the 32 CFR Part 202.14, you must establish a controlled environment to which to protect CUI from unauthorized access or disclosure and make use of those controlled environments. You can only have CUI in a controlled environment. Many of you may not realize that. And if you look at 3, it says that you must keep it underneath direct control of you within that control environment. And if it's outside that control environment, you must protect it from unauthorized access and observation. Well, guess what, folks? That goes with the safeguarding requirements relative to this requirement, 3.10.5, manage physical access to CUI. So how do we do that? Well, we do that by implementing these NIST controls, which are broken down not just by the controls themselves, but the individual assessment objectives, which can be applied to marking CUI and protecting CUI within a controlled environment. So when you mark CUI and when you protect CUI, you can apply that to all of these controls and the specific in part or in whole to these specific assessment objectives. The controlled environment, as defined in the 32 CFR, says that it's any space that your organization has confidence that you have physical and procedural protections that are sufficient to meet requirements for establishing the protection of the information system or the information itself. And the information itself could be in any form, including parts and pieces and so on and so forth. Now, the DoD Instruction 5248 gives you specific guidance about what it means from a DoD perspective about having a controlled environment. And it means that you have sufficient internal security measures in place to prevent or detect unauthorized access to CUI. So you must have these in place in order to meet the requirements for what? For this right here, managing physical access to CUI. And if you do not, you cannot affirm. And if you cannot affirm, you cannot advance to being qualified for contracts in phase 1. And you certainly cannot advance to being CMMC certified until you meet that requirement, because it is a prohibited poem item underneath the 32 CFR Part 170.21. Okay, so that means when you put up a sign that says restricted area, authorized personnel, you are beginning to do what it takes to manage the physical access to CUI. That sign must be monitored and must be enforced. It can be monitored by technical means. It can be monitored by people or both. But at the end of the day, that these the standards and the protections, the controls that you put in place at the management operational and technical levels must be monitored and must be enforced. And you must be able to detect whether or not that those requirements have been violated. Now, as I mentioned, underneath the SF 901, it doesn't, alternate marking methods are not addressed by the CUI Marking Training Aid, the latest iteration. You would follow the NARA CUI guidance. And I highly recommend that you do this, because this protects your documents in your environment in a controlled area from being accessed by unauthorized individuals, if that's monitored and certainly enforced, with the ability to detect whether or not unauthorized people have access to that area and whether or not that they've removed that cover sheet for direct observation of CUI. Okay. If you are at home, just like here, the exact same requirements would apply underneath 3.10.5. So you must manage your environment, whether at home or whether in the workspace, exactly in the same manner in which you must manage a controlled environment in your production area. Okay, so you have to mark things if it's you shouldn't be accessing CUI on unauthorized devices. So if it is an authorized device, it must be marked. If you print CUI at home for whatever reason, then guess what? It must be marked. It must be safeguarded. You must consider your home office, your alternate work site, a controlled environment, and it must have the ability to do so underneath DoD requirements and your policy. All right. So we've covered a lot. I know we're 6 minutes over, and I apologize for that. So let's get down to some questions, because we covered 72 slides in an hour and a half and a lot of data. All right, so let's start talking about that. All right. And I appreciate your time and your patience. So let's get to your questions. Okay, and I'm sure there are many. All right. So, Abdullah, hey, great to have you on, Abdullah. Great to see you as always. Mark Parsons asked, is the current version of the CMC Model 213 correct? It is, Mike. And you should, and anyone out there should be very careful not to use any other supplemental document because there are actually errors in those documents. And we fixed those errors, and I'm very grateful to the DoD that listened to outside recommendations, and they have fixed those errors. So those documents are stellar documents, but they in themselves, as I've mentioned, are not entirely sufficient. John Patine asked, is the government supposed to mark CUI before sending it to DoD contractors? If the government has a specific document, John, like a document that they wrote, not the statement of work, not your contract clause, not the things that they're telling you to build, but a specific document or communication between you and them, yes, they are supposed to mark it. But that doesn't mean that the all of the documents that you create from your statement of work, right? They don't the DoD doesn't design anything, right? They don't design the stealth fighter, they don't design the J-35 or the F-35, they don't design the tank. They only approve the contract for the tank and the statement of work. So that's where the confusion is that, oh, well, the DoD didn't mark this document. Well, the DoD doesn't have to mark the document. If the document was created in the performance of the contract relative to the contract clause in the statement of work. So he says, if so, and they send potential CUI via unencrypted email, what's supposed to happen? Well, listen, it's in my experience in the past, if oftentimes documents are either mismarked by the DoD or they send a document the way that they're not supposed to do that. Technically, that is an unauthorized disclosure. You, as a contractor, should delete that document, okay, and inform the sender that to send it in a compliant fashion and provide them. I would if I were you, provide them a compliant means of sending that information. Okay. All right. Now, just because it's an unauthorized disclosure, does it mean it's reportable to the DoD CI? No, it's not underneath DoD Instruction 50248. It will be underneath the FAR CUI rule, but it's not underneath the DoD Instruction 50248. So if they send a potential, let's see, what is supposed to happen? Are contractors supposed to ask every time an email comes in with the potential for CUI? No, they're not. But they have to recognize if an email is CUI, because if an email if a email contains CUI and it's qualifying information that is unmarked, you are responsible for identifying that it is CUI, and you are responsible for taking action on it. Okay, so if it is unmarked CUI that qualifies as CUI, you would inform the sender that we've deleted this email and that the information needs to be sent through a compliant method. Okay. According to the salespeople in my company, .mail email addresses only send the DDC safe and it's happening to student. Okay, so this happens all the time, John. So a lot of times the DoD will send you a document, right? And if the document's too big, then they'll send it through DoD safe. Well, that's not correct. The document should go through DoD safe. So if you don't have a compliant method for the DoD to send you the document, meaning GCC high, then the document should be, or maybe you haven't invested, or you've got some other means, such as Prevail or another means of receiving CUI, you would ask them to send it that way. If not, the DoD should be sending you through DoD Safe, no matter what size the attachment is. Okay? All right. I hope that's helpful. All right, anonymous attendee. If we have old CUI in our system that is not marked and was never a part of an active contract, provide to us for quoting purposes only, is there an official method for destruction or removal? Yes. So there is official method. So the initial correct method is the NIST SP 888. Okay. That requires a statement of disposition. So let's say you have a document. You said I'm going to destroy this document using a DoD compliant or NIST 888 compliant shredder. Okay, good. Well, then you would create the memorandum that says we destroyed this document, and then you would have that filed wherever you keep your your archive documents. All right. If you burned it, you could burn it. NIST 888 allows for that, and so does DoD policy. If you have a third party pick it up, the third party does have to meet requirements in order for them to be an authorized holder of that information. So, yes, you can get rid of it. Yes, you need to do it in compliant fashion, and it needs to be beyond any means of recovery. Okay, that at the end of the day, that's exactly what the requirement is. So John Patine says labeling CUI. I hope that was helpful to you. Whoever wrote that, anonymous attendee. Okay, it is a nightmare. It is a nightmare, by the way. See, hang on, I skipped over this. SMB boss says everything within the land perimeter is CUI. It may be. It's hard to tell. If the land is if the entire enterprise is in scope of the essential capabilities necessary to perform the work, then it certainly could be in scope, and that's a totally different thing. But it may not be permitted to be in scope, but it may be in scope because you haven't restricted or limited it, anonymous attendee. Okay, but let's assume that what you're saying is true. The CUI is going to only those recipients who are authorized to access the CUI, and it's going only to those essential capabilities necessary to perform the contract. Then the entire enterprise would be in scope. He does not want to have to inventory CUI. You do not have to inventory CUI per se, meaning the documents themselves. That's not required. But you do have to inventory according to the NIST, according to the DoD scoping guide. You do have to inventory all those assets that are involved in the processing, storing, or transmitting a CUI. And there are other categories of assets as well, which must be identified in your SSP according to the appropriate CUI category, or according to the appropriate asset category. All right, I hope that makes sense. But you need to read 213, the scoping guide, to understand that. But read it in very close attention to detail, their anonymous attendee, because there are important changes from the old version, the 210 version, to the 213. Any asset that is in scope, meaning there is a table there, and it says all these things are in scope, all of these things are not in scope. Okay, anything in the in scope categories of CUI assets is in scope of both the DFAR 7012 requirements, is in scope of SPRS, is in scope of a DIBCAC audit, and specifically for the CMC assessment, they are C3POs are given specific guidance on what's the focus of their assessment. But if a C3PO starts looking checks on, which they're allowed to do and they should do, check on the other categories of CUI assets, and they do not the other categories of CMC assets, and those assets do not meet 7012 requirements, then you're done. That assessment should be over. Stephen Green, hey, great to see you, man. Thank you for being here. Sorry, ignored late. Are you going to provide a recorded copy of this? I'm not. I'm sorry. Let me caveat this. That this webinar is actually going to be on our website underneath the events, I believe. But not the slides. So great to see you, Steve. Okay. Doug Symes says in Dobster 25R78, page 7. Okay, so you're already quoting. Hang on just a second. Let me just verify this. I want to make sure that you're quoting the right Dobster number. Sorry, hang on just a second. Okay. Let's make sure everyone's on the same sheet of music. Okay. All right. So this Dobster number is the Dobster you should be using, not the older Dobster number. All right. Just to make sure everyone's clear. All right. So page 7, distribution statements are listed for subcategories of CUI. That's true. Export control. If an OSC in the DIB derives CTI or export control and performance of the contract, then the distribution statement is required. And that's true. It is. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean there could be an instance where a distribution statement D a derivative document would not receive a distribution statement D. You know, I don't want to get into the what ifs, but it's possible. However, very likely that the parent-child relationship of a derivative document from its parent document would likely carry the same distribution statement if the same restrictions apply. Okay. No, it doesn't require the distribution statement isn't required for the government agency to generate it because if the previous if the parent document has the distribution statement and it applies, then you would simply copy and paste it over to the new document. If there is no previous distribution statement, you could simply mark it in the CUI identifier on a CUI indicator box. You can mark it as distribution D. Okay. All right. Can an OSC subcontractor create a distribution statement? You can. And there's actually the DoD instruction 5230.24 provides for this. It gives the instructions for this, and on how to do that. But the original distribution limitations are directed by the DoD. And if for some reason there's a disconnect between you and them, then you can certainly reach out to them, right? Or you can distribution D is a safe go-to. Okay. The only hanky part of that is what happens if you've been given no guidance that and it may be foreign restricted access to foreign persons. You need to check your contract because the guidance on access to foreign information is not in the DFAR 712 contract clause specifically. It's not in there. It's in the additional clauses and the additional guidance in that contract. So in the contract, Army Corps of Engineers is specifically terrible for this. In the contract, it's not going to mention in the DFAR 712 because that's not what the clause says. But in the contract, it provides provisions for the restrictions for that information to foreign persons or non-U.S. persons. Okay. So you need to go back to your contract and make sure that it does not have any specific non-U.S. persons restrictions in that contracting language. All right. And no one's going to see it unless you specifically look for it. All right. I hope that was helpful. So if so, what just to tap on put a pin on this. And so Doug says, well, what would you insert in the DoD controlling office? If you don't have that information, you can leave that blank. The controlling authority would be you, would be your company. And again, I want to make sure that Regan isn't making this up because remember that what I read to you previously in the in the thick of the other previous information was that and I'm going to bring that up so that everyone's clear. All right, Regan's not making things up because that's not what we do here. Okay. Underneath this, it says that contractors are authorized to create, let me move this because you guys can't see. Contractors are authorized to create and make documents and can be listed as the POC in the designated indicator block. Okay, so your company would be the controlling authority if you are the originator of the information. The ultimate controlling authority certainly is the DoD, so that would be the DoD program office. Okay, and you should know, by the way, if you don't know where your DoD stuff goes to, you don't have to know all the classified gobbledygook, but you are responsible according to the ITAR and EAR and according to DoD policy for knowing the in use of the items that you create in performance of your contract. So if you make something for a DoD program, you are responsible for identifying that it is a DoD in use. You are responsible for identifying that. Okay. So ignorance is not bliss here. Well, we make it, but we don't know where it goes to because they won't tell us. That's nonsense. If you make something, you are responsible for knowing that it's going to a DoD program. The program name may be classified, but the acquisition authority relative to that contract is not classified, and it can be classified. So you have to know that information. All right. What inspection data or CMMM may be classified as CUI? What inspection data off of a CMM? I'm not sure what you mean by CMM anonymous attendee. Would only list dimensions and no blueprints. Okay, yeah. So if you have the contract statement of work with the DFAR 7012, and it lists the dimensions. Those dimensions are specifications, right? They are, and they're look at the detail in section 1.1 and the requisite definitions that I pointed to in the glossary of DoD instruction 5230.24. All right. Is the prime contractor responsible for any CUI created or by a sub? Of course they are. Yes. And do you want me to show you? I will show you exactly, because I knew this was going to come up. All right. I'll show exactly where they are responsible for. Okay. Current DoD policy, not in the future, not underneath Rev 3. Underneath Rev 3, they certainly are. But the current DoD policy current DoD policy underneath the DoD procurement toolbox says specifically that the responsibilities for CUI are the responsibility of the prime contractor for all of its subcontractors and all of its subcontractors. Okay. And you are responsible for, if you have subcontractors, responsible for your subcontractors. And the DFAR 7021 contract clause will require you to validate the fact that they have met requirements, not just send them an email. That those days are long gone. Okay. So you better get ready for what the DFAR's, the new update to the DFAR's 252, 204, 7021 CMC certification clause will have in store for you. And it's out there and available. The final draft is expected any day now. Okay. If we provide a supplier who will finish a process that is CUI and we provide them with CUI notice within the package, can the supplier use that same notification when returning their package to us? Yes, they can, but it's not the notification alone. Not the notification alone that's the key element here. The key element is that you cannot share CUI underneath DoD policy and the 32 CFR Part 202 unless you know that the recipient is knowledgeable and will handle the information accordingly. Okay, so if you know that the whomever you share the information to does not meet requirements, you cannot share CUI back to them. Okay, now that makes it awfully weird. But if you have a prime contractor or higher tier contractor that's not meeting requirements, that doesn't that one or two particular times doesn't mean that they're not compliant, because non-compliance under 712 doesn't mean that they are not compliant. That's a circular statement. That's a lengthy explanation. If they have a POAM and they've met the minimum documentation requirements and they're working on their POAM, then they meet the minimum basic requirements, and they can be recipients. But your subcontractors, whom you haven't checked on, who you send an email and Bob replied, "Yep, we got it," that is not in DoD policy, and you are setting yourself up for failure. All right. I'm a CCP instructor. That's awesome, Brett. I'm glad to have you in the fight. How to get to EU? Speak Italian. How to get to EU? So Europe. Okay, so I just came from Europe and I spent time in Portugal and spent time in Zurich, and listen, there's a challenge there. Okay, there's obviously a language barrier. That's Brett. And not just a language barrier. They may speak English, but some of the language associated with what we're teaching are very specific in their definitions and their technical definitions, and sometimes it doesn't translate very well. So those are definitely challenges related to that. I'm very fortunate enough to, I think, been only the second or maybe one of the very few CCP courses to ever be taught with boots on the ground in Europe. And so you have to be, as a CCP instructor, of course, our goal is to communicate this effectively. So you have to make sure that you are walking through the information in an effective manner. However, there's a proliferation of abundance of written materials, and oftentimes people understand the English language and can read the English language better than they can actually speak it. So just because their native language may not communicate effectively doesn't mean that they're not getting the information correctly. All right. So right now, the primary language, the official language for the CMC program is English. So they must be they're not if they want to be a CCP, they're not translating the test into other foreign languages, right? Or as far as I know. All right. if a government posts CUI, and I know we're 30 minutes over, so if this is interest you, I'm glad to continue to go, okay? Because I want to honor what people the time that they've taken.
You've still
So
got well over 40 people still engaged, so you're doing.
okay, that's great. And if you have questions, listen, I'm here until you don't have questions anymore, okay? This is that important. So, thanks for that, Xavier. So,
Mhm.
if the government, which is pretty amazing, by the way, thank you for we're 2 hours into this. Thank you for doing this. 40 minutes or longer over, and I just genuinely appreciate that. I really do. All right. So, if the government posts CUI documents on SAM and it's available to anyone to download, is the contractor obligated to report this? Okay, so this is a complex thing. All right. So if it is on SAM and it really is CUI, which I would very first thing is I would not be sure that it actually is CUI, then the answer is you are obligated to report it. Okay, because that's you can do that anonymously. So let's don't no one wants to be the no one wants to be the whistleblower here, but reach out to the contracting officer. You can do it through anonymous email and tell them, hey, there's CUI documents on there, and they shouldn't be publicly available. So the question is it lawfully publicly available? So if the document is on, let's say the document is CUI and it really is on SAM, but it hasn't been decontrolled yet. So the authority, the contracting officer accidentally put it on SAM. Okay. If the information hasn't been decontrolled, which means it would have a line, it would have gone through this review process, have a line through it, and say this information is not CUI. Okay. If that hasn't happened, then the information has not been released and is not lawfully publicly available. It has to be decontrolled underneath a specific set of parameters that the DoD describes in the DoD Instruction 5248. If that has not happened, it is not lawfully publicly available, which means that even if they don't catch the error, okay, and it comes to you, that document is still CUI, okay. But in the national security interest, I would urge you, and you can do so anonymously. I would urge you to reach out to the contracting authority and say, "Hey, this document should be on there. It's marked as CUI. Please remove the document or double check and make sure it's really not CUI and remove the marking." Okay. All right. Hope that's helpful. So, anonymous attendee says, "Can we email documents directly to the DoD if our company's migrated to a GCCH environment?" Yes, you can. So as long as the document meets the encryption requirements. Now, but the to the point though, anonymous attendee, is you need to follow the examples in the new CUI marking training aid about how that email or any attachments or the information inside the email should be properly marked. Okay, so yeah, you can send it to them, but that doesn't absolve you from marking the email, marking the subject line, and marking the attachments. Okay. Jeffrey King. Hi, Reagan. Great section. Hey, appreciate you, brother. You mentioned during the presentation that LDCs such as FedCon are not used with distribution statements, and that's true. On cited 5230.24 and DoD 5248. Are you able to point me to what section says that? Yes, I am. That's no problem. The the right off the top of my head that now I know this has been superseded, but the old DoD CUI marking guide said that, okay? And I know it's been superseded by the new one, and I know it's not in the new CUI marking guide. But there's someplace else that says that too, and that must be in it must be in DoD instruction 5230.24, or it might be in the DoD procurement toolbox. So look in the DoD procurement toolbox. I think it's like question 22. I can't remember off the top of my head. There's a section there that goes in index it, search for marking, and it may say it in one of the answers. So I apologize that I can't recall that just right off the top of my head. But I do know just off the top of my head, I do know that specifically that it did say that in the DoD, the old DoD CUI marking guide, which has obviously been superseded. But I'm pretty doggone sure that that is. I'll look for that. I'll look for that. I apologize. It's 2 hours of recitation. Let's see. So Jeff, send me something over LinkedIn, and that way I remember it. I'm not sure that I can get to it today, but I will do my best to send an email back to you or send a message back to you. So I appreciate you and thank you for being here, by the way. Okay, John Patine says, "Thank you, Reagan. This makes sense to me. Seems to be fair." Okay, great. That was a long first question. It's probably a longer answer, but it sometimes it takes more words to explain it than it does to actually inform people. Okay, so listen, you guys are outstanding, and I genuinely appreciate you, and I hope this has been valuable to you. If it has been valuable to you, I ask that you go on LinkedIn and you just make a comment in the post. We've got several posts floating about this thing, and just give the feedback so that others realize these value, because what we want to do is we do these not because we need more clients, because we're only taking clients by exception now. What we do this for the public good, for you guys out there that may have not understood these requirements clearly, in support of the CMC Industry Standards Council and in support of the DoD ecosystem or the CMC ecosystem in getting this right. So we want other future CMMC war rooms to be to be highlighted so that people who may not be clear about whatever the subject matter is will take the time to attend them just like you have, and so that they can be informed about these requirements. All right. Thanks, Doug. I appreciate it. Thank you, John, and all of you. Thank you, and you have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you out in the trenches or at the next series of events, and we will talk to you soon. Remember that together we can secure freedom defense supply chain. Have a great day.